called The Grammar of Messianism, subtitle An Ancient Jewish Political Idiom and Its Users. It's out with Oxford University Press. It's out in the US in May 2017, in the UK in June 2017. So it's an academic monograph, hopefully though interesting to lots of people with interests in ancient Judaism and Christianity. It's a study of messianism in ancient Jewish and also some Christian texts, but it's a study of that field from a rather different angle than has usually been done. So the title, The Grammar of Messianism, signals that I'm trying to look at evidence from a straightforwardly linguistic angle. So in other words, rather than what one usually finds in books on this topic, starting with a construct of the messianic idea and then trying to tell its history or trace an arc across sort of the Persian, Hellenistic, Roman periods and so on. Instead, what I've tried to do is start with the ancient texts that actually use the form of words, Messiah. So this is commonplace in scholarship, but all this goes back to Hebrew, the Hebrew word Mashiach, from the verb mashach, to anoint, so an anointed thing or person. But that word then gets picked up and used in not only in Hebrew, but in Aramaic and later Syriac and other Semitic languages, and it's translated into Greek as Christos, which is where we get the word Christ from, and on into Latin and Coptic and other early Christian languages. So I wanted to look at all those texts that actually, in their own terms, talk about messiahs and see what kind of picture emerges about how that idiom works, the work that it does for different authors, and the purposes it serves. And if you come at it that way, as opposed to starting with a sort of construct of an idea and trying to find it in text, then you do get a very different kind of outcome. So the way the book's organized then, again, is kind of unconventional. The traditional way this is done is that scholars will try to trace a messianic idea starting in ancient Israel and then sort of moving through Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, and depending on the book, sometimes the Byzantine periods, the Middle Ages, and onward. The way this book is organized instead is around a series of problems or rubrics. So there's a number of ways that sort of in the modern literature we've learned to understand messianism, and each of my chapters sort of challenges a number of those ways, those rubrics. So there's a chapter on the origins of the idiom in the Hebrew Bible and the popular scholarly idea that there's a sort of sharp division between the biblical usage where an anointed person is a mundane, this worldly political ruler, and then later usage where an anointed or Messiah figure becomes a superhuman, divine being. And I try to show how while that distinction applies in a few cases, actually there's lots of other cases in which post-biblical texts effectively reproduce lots of biblical uses of the term. There's a chapter on the question of ancestry or genealogy, what family one has to be from in order to be called a Messiah. This has to do with there's a widespread connection in ancient texts between being a son of David or being from the house of David and being a Messiah. But then there are also lots of Messiahs in ancient texts who don't appear to have genealogical credentials like that. So I have a chapter trying to sort out for the ancient writers what are the rules by which you make those kinds of claims. There's a chapter called Messiahs Present and Absent on a very popular hypothesis in scholarship that's often called the messianic vacuum, that there's a period or periods in Jewish history when messianism disappears, sort of goes underground, or where there's a vacuum. And so I have a chapter questioning that, which I think is not kind of an adequate descriptor, because it assumes that messianism is something that should be there everywhere and always, and so when it's absent, we have anxiety about trying to explain why, which I think is just a manufactured anxiety. There's a chapter on the quest for the first Messiah, which is a big sort of modern scholarly project that assumes that there has to be some starting point, some patient zero that we could find in ancient texts that would explain, well, for most scholars who do this, explain the origins of Christianity, actually. And so this quest for the first Messiah has been closely associated with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then recently, in the 21st century, it's been connected with this text written in ink on stone called Chazon Gabriel, or the Vision of Gabriel, or Revelation of Gabriel. And so in this chapter, I assess a lot of these proposals for whether there's whether one could identify the first Messiah at Qumran in the Dead Sea sect. And there too, I argue that I think that's the belief that we have to find such a thing in order to explain the text we have is simply a mistaken starting point. So there's a chapter on the Jewish Messiah, Christian Messiah distinction, which is another sort of commonplace in lots of books on this topic, that beginning already in antiquity, even in the first century, according to many, Jews mean one thing by Messiah, and Christians mean a different thing altogether. And I sort of interrogate that way of talking about it, and try to understand why that's been persuasive to modern scholars, and then I turn up lots of ancient evidence that sort of makes the distinction break down on both sides, I think. There's a chapter on what happens to Messiah Christology, that is the Christian belief that Jesus is the Messiah in the first several Christian centuries. Again, it's a common idea that Jewish traditions around Messianism became more or less useless to the early Christians, but they kept the name Christ and then they just redefined it to mean something different. And one of my arguments is that's not in fact what we find in the sources, that although Christians over several centuries found it important to say lots of very different kinds of things about Jesus, new things relative to what they had said in the earliest period, it's remarkable actually how they stick, they hang on to not only the name Christ, but the etymology of that, the fact that it has something to do with anointing, and so you get all kinds of Christian speculation about how, when, by whom, and with what Jesus got anointed such that he could be called Christ or anointed. So the book amounts to a sort of series of case studies of topics in ancient texts about messiahs in critical dialogue with lots of received scholarly ways of thinking. And what emerges from it, I think, is the conclusion that if you come at the evidence from just a quite different angle, rather than starting with a modern idea or definition that we want to confirm or disconfirm, but rather just try to start with the particulars in the ancient text and sort of work inductively up, then you get a very different picture. And lots more texts are able to come into discussion and comparison that have hitherto been neglected, or not so much neglected, but actively excluded because they're thought not to play by the rules of the idea we're looking for. So it's an argument that if you have a look at the grammar of Messianism, that is the way the words work, the rules of the game for writing these kind of texts, then actually you could potentially find all sorts of new and interesting things about many texts that are very familiar to us, and then lots of texts that are unfamiliar to us, but perhaps shouldn't be.